Hi guys, today I want to bring you a detailed and direct comparison between fire bowazon builds and cold bowazon builds, and answer any questions that you would expect that would come along with comparing these two types of bowazon builds, such as what are their strengths and weaknesses, which areas are they best to farm in, which of them have an easier gearing roadmap, and which build type is better overall. For those new to the channel, we're looking at builds that use the core skills of Exploding Arrow and Immolation Arrow for the fire bowazon, and Freezing Arrow for the cold bowazon. Each build type will use a gear for their respective build, such as the right Sunder Charms if they're on ladder, bows like Ice, Phoenix, Wizendraw, Kuko Shikaku, Melody or Mist, and then a series of bow Skilligran Charms along with Plague or Infinity on a Mercenary depending on the budget level. For the purposes of this video, Magesons or hybrid cold/fire bowazons won't be covered in this video as they are really a topic of their own. So anyway, to jump into things. For strengths and weaknesses, the three skills Exploding Arrow, Immolation Arrow, and Freezing Arrow behave in similar ways in that they all shoot one arrow that explodes on impact, dealing area of effect damage. However, each of these skills have their own workings, and for the case of Exploding and Immolation Arrow versus Freezing Arrow, different damage types being fire and cold. Both fire and cold damage deal instantaneous damage to their targets, though for cold in addition, it also applies a chill or freeze effect on the monsters depending on the skill. For Freezing Arrow, both cold damage and a freezing effect is delivered to any monsters that are within its explosion impact, whereas for Exploding Arrow, only fire damage is delivered with no other effects. This is where Freezing Arrow is unique and powerful, because being able to freeze multiple monsters with a single arrow means that those group of monsters will no longer try to swing at you or shoot at you, making surviving an easier task. And in areas where you're fighting against monsters that can be revived, monsters that are frozen always shatter when they are killed, which is a huge tactical advantage where without this you could be fighting against an endless revived army. However, there are monsters that can only be chilled and therefore can still attack you. Those are champions, uniques, super uniques, and bosses such as Bale or Nilthak. Then there are certain monsters that can't even be chilled at all, such as monsters that are cold immune, or monsters such as Ghosts, Dolls, Gloams, and Deathlords, which have what's called the chill effectiveness set to 0. So keep all this in mind if you're planning on making a cold bowazon. Shattering monsters also has its own drawbacks as well, particularly if you're playing in a party, as shattering monsters will prevent skeleton summons, revives, corpse explosion, or find item being used by your party members. In that respect, fire bowazons can be more friendly for your party, even though the freezing effect can also be helpful at times as well. And last but not least, both fire and cold bow skills benefit from flat elemental damage. So cold damage increases freezing arrow damage, and fire damage increases both exploding arrow and immolation arrow damage. However, the fire skills have a distinct advantage here, as flat fire damage from gear is almost universally higher. And if you have an enchantress on your team, so that is a sorceress that maxes out the enchant skill, then this will dramatically increase your exploding and immolation arrow damage. For the cold and fire bow skills themselves, exploding arrow has the lowest damage out of the three skills. Freezing arrow then has considerably more damage than exploding arrow. And then Immolation Arrow is a little higher than Freezing Arrow and has the highest damage out of all elemental bow skills, but has a 0.6 second cooldown, which affects its overall DPS by capping the rate of fire of Immolation Arrow to just over 1.6 shots per second. By contrast, Freezing Arrow using the Ice Rune word can reach a top attack speed of 3.125 shots per second. Based on this, we can see that Freezing Arrow and by extension Cold Bowazons have a higher theoretical DPS than Fire Bowazons. However, this doesn't actually translate to cold bowazons clearing content faster than fire bowazons. After extensively testing both top-end fire and cold bowazon builds, this is what I found. I'll display the results of the top two of each fire bowazon and cold bowazon builds that perform the best in Players 1 and Players 8 in the Sacred Cow level. These test builds have been linked in the video description so that you can check out those builds. We can see that fire bowazon build slightly edged out cold bowazon builds in performance in Players 1, but more notably, this performance difference widens quite a bit in Players 8, so why is that? There's a couple of reasons for this. The main reason is because of the different damage types of the skills. Freezing Arrow freezes monsters in place, whereas Exploding Arrow and Immolation Arrow do not. When we think about how all these elemental bow skills work with its AoE for the explosion effects, they inflict the most damage when monsters are tightly grouped together. When we then think about how the monster's AI works, for instance cows, they walk towards you or your mercenary or Valkyrie. Well, monsters that are frozen by Freezing Arrow do not walk towards you and do not then clump up. Because of this, the fire bow skills are able to more easily inflict their potential damage, while the cold bowazon will find it more difficult to do so as monsters stay spread out more often. And yes, it's true, monsters can be put into hit recovery and be stopped, but Hit recovery doesn't always happen and happens less often in higher player settings and lasts for a much shorter duration of about 1/3 of a second, allowing monsters to move soon after. The other reason is for the ice rune in particular is because of the Holy Freeze aura on a bow that slows monsters' movement speed, even for monsters not frozen by freezing arrow. So for anyone looking to make an elemental bowazon build, the main things to take away from this are: the freezing effect from freezing arrow has some nice crowd controlling effects that prevent monsters from attacking you. Frozen monsters that get killed shatter, preventing other monsters from reviving those monsters again, but also prevents your party members from using find item, raising skeletons or revives, or using corpse explosion, or the redemption aura from consuming the corpse for life and mana recovery. And it also prevents monsters from clumping up, which reduces freezing arrow's potential damage output. Now you're not going to be always fighting cows, you're going to be fighting in areas with a mix of melee and ranged monsters, or monsters that move at different speeds, and definitely the cow level is a high density area as well. So my message here is don't let theory crafted numbers or the cooldown on immolation arrow make you think that freezing arrow is vastly superior to exploding arrow and immolation arrow. Both fire bowazons and cold bowazons do feel good to play and do largely perform as well as each other. It's about recognizing the differences between the skills and the cold and fire damage types and considering this in your overall gameplay. For example, a fire bowazon build will need a tankier Valkyrie and mercenary as they will get hit more often, and a cold bowazon consumes more mana and so needs more ways to sustain her mana. It's also about understanding gear progression for these two types of builds and what areas you're looking to clear or farm. So the next part I'll cover is gear progression. For gear progression, I'll break this up into 3 parts. The early game, where we look at gear before any practical ability to break monster immunities at all. The mid game, where being able to break monster immunities and more avenues to reduce enemy resistances open up. And finally the late game, opening up all gear options and how these options step things up even further. During the early game, both fire and cold bowazons have similar options as each other, with 2 notable bows that are element specific. Wizendraw and Kuko Shikaku, with a slight advantage going to cold bowazons for how early Wizendraw can be found, and for how potent that minus enemy cold resistance can become going into Nightmare and Hell difficulties, as well as when you eventually start to stack plus skill gear or bow skill or grand charms. Into Hell, the Mavina set is a very solid option for cold bowazons specifically, and while all the pieces are very hard to find solo, they can be traded for quite cheaply if you're playing online. Both fire and cold bowazons can stack mana after each kill, flat elemental damage, and increase attack speed from their items at this early stage, as well as give their mercenary an insight weapon for that meditation aura. So although freezing arrow can consume a lot of mana, there are ways to mitigate this at this early stage with items or by placing points into energy for these builds. So really the main barriers for fire and cold bowazons are their ability to take out immunes. And although cold bowazons have a slight natural disadvantage with immunes, both build types can take advantage of Harmony as a damage fallback anyway. And if you're not quite Terror Zone farming yet, then it's easy enough to target farm specific level 85 areas that do not contain monsters that are immune to your element, such as Ancient Tunnels and Arachnid Lair for cold, or Stony Tombs for both fire and cold. And lastly, if you're not at a too high of a character level, both your Mercenary and Valkyrie may not be super tanky, especially with budget gear, so that freezing effect from Freezing Arrow will be quite valuable at this stage. So with those things considered, the cold bowazon has an edge in the early game. During the mid game is where options for Sunder Charms and some of the mid to high tier rune words open up. Specifically here, we're talking about Fire and Cold Sunder Charms, Plague and Flickering Flame rune words, Fire and Cold Rainbow Facets, and specific gear such as Nightwing's Veil for cold bowazons. Most of these items are only available in ladder, and of these items, Sunder Charms and a Plague Rune Word are the only items that unlock a practical option to break monster immunities. If you're playing on non-ladder, then there's not much new for you in the mid-game stage other than Rainbow Facets or a Nightwing's Veil for a cold bowazon to further boost damage. If you're playing on ladder, then you get some convenient options open up to you to break monster immunities with Sunder Charms, as well as a variety of other options to further reduce enemy resistances with the Plague Rune Word for its lower resist proc that you can equip 1 or 2 of on an Act 5 mercenary, and a Flickering Flame rune word for plus fire skills and up to minus 15% enemy fire resistance if you're running a fire bowazon. For a fire bowazon, a fire Sunder Charm, Flickering Flame and Plague together provide a viable option for dealing with fire immune monsters effectively. For a cold bowazon using Wizendraw, adding just 1 cold Sunder Charm will allow them to deal with cold immune monsters effectively as well. So the barrier of entry for dealing with immunities is much lower for a cold bowazon and can also be complemented with a Plague as well, but that is more optional. If you are considering going with a plague on a cold bowazon mercenary, keep in mind that your freezing arrow shots will freeze enemies and therefore prevent most monsters from attacking your mercenary. So that lower resist proc on plague will not trigger very often. Whereas for a fire bowazon, you should expect a lower resist proc from plague to go off more reliably. Just make sure your mercenary is tanky enough to withstand all those hits. So with those additional item options, the fire bowazon's able to equalize things a bit, and although a cold bowazon using a cold sunder charm will have a harder time making up the loss of cold resistance, I would still give a very slight edge to cold bowazons for that lower barrier of entry to dealing with immune monsters, as well as that damage boost from Nightwing's Veil. During the late game, where all other item options open up, this is where we start to talk about your enigmas, infinities, perfect facets, and all the high-end bow options. If you're playing non-ladder, Infinity grants a viable option for breaking some monster immunities, and with that, fire bowazons have an advantage here as more fire immunities are broken with Infinity than cold immunities are broken. If you're playing on ladder and already using a Plague and Sunder charm, Infinity provides a solid upgrade for lowering resistances that is both stronger and more reliable than a Plague Rune word. In any case, late game opens up a lot of high-end bow options such as Ice, Phoenix, and Matriarchal bows socketed with perfect facets, which the time results of these bows and nuances of the fire and cold elements have been covered earlier in this video, with fire bowazons clearing content faster overall. From a cost perspective, all of the high-end bow options require either high runes or perfectly rolled rainbow facets to make, and therefore expensive or very hard to obtain. Both Phoenix and Ice require jar and low runes, but the Ice rune word in particular requires multiple rune word rolls to achieve a perfect roll on its cold skill damage. Though thankfully, this varies from 25 to 30%, so even on a bad roll, Ice is still going to be effective no matter what. For Phoenix, other than the constant minus 28% enemy fire resistance stat, has a number of varying stats on the rune word also, but all of them are fairly inconsequential for fire bowazon's effectiveness, and getting a max roll in these stats are more of a nice to have. Otherwise, most of the gear between a fire and cold bowazon doesn't vary all too much, though a fire bowazon can also upgrade their flickering flame to a 3 perfect fire faceted jeweler's diadem of speed, and then transfer the flickering flame over to the mercenaries to still benefit from that resist fire aura to offset any fire resistance loss from the fire sunder charm. So in summary, both the fire and cold bowazon builds gear progression roadmaps are similar but have their differences, with cold bowazons having an upper hand in the early parts of this journey. On the high end, getting 8 perfect fire facets and a GG circlet for 3 of those is certainly a daunting task. So the fire bowazon has a higher gear ceiling in the endgame, but at the same time, higher clear speed potential in high density areas or in high players difficulties. So the verdict? Fire bowazons and cold bowazons are 2 different flavours of an elemental bowazon that share a lot of similarities, but obviously we wouldn't be this far into the video without the builds having a number of differences. For party play, fire bowazons take the cake easily as a better option for playing together with others. While cold bowazons can be more useful in certain team setups, necromancers will find it more difficult to get his summons up and going, or use corpse explosion to wipe out screens of monsters if there are no corpses left for him to use. In the same vein, barbarians will also find it more difficult to use find item to potentially hawk that GG item. I mean, you never know, right? And for any parties that have an enchantress, her enchant will roughly double the fire bowazon's damage output. So if you have necromancers or barbarians in your party, they'll thank you for not shattering their corpses, and if you have any enchantresses in your party, you'll love her as well. Party play aside, if you're expecting to do a lot of solo play or exclusively play solo, then it'll be a much closer contest. For the early to mid game, cold bowazons have a lower barrier of entry to viably handling cold immune monsters with Wizendraw and a cold sunder charm. Fire bowazons do equalise things in the mid game with a flickering flame, plague and a fire sunder charm, but cold bowazons still have a slight edge at this stage as well. The freezing effect from freezing arrow can be valuable to help keep you and your mercenaries safe during stages where you are under leveled or under geared. So for the early to mid game, cold bowazons have a slight upper hand. Going into the late game, this is where fire bowazons can realise more of their potential. Adding an Infinity, Enigma and a whole bunch of perfect fire facets into the mix improves the fire bowazon's ability to farm areas with fire immunes. Enigma speeds up the gameplay for both fire and cold bowazons, and the teleport and life after each kill makes survival an easier task for the elemental bowazon. This is a great benefit for fire bowazons where crowd control with freezing arrow is not an option. And with the high-end bows available, fire bowazon's practical DPS can exceed cold bowazons using ice, with Phoenix being the safer option and a 5-faceted bow being a higher risk but higher reward option for a fire bowazon. So for the late game, fire bowazons have a slight upper hand over cold bowazons. And finally, for overall enjoyment, this is probably too subjective to say one over the other, and it really depends on what kind of playstyle you're looking for. If you're a power gamer that can coordinate using exploding and immolation arrow together, and you enjoy that very conscious gameplay that if you're not playing carefully could land you in trouble, then a fire bowazon using a 5-faceted matriarchal bow could be the build for you. If you're a more passive player that draws enjoyment from clearing areas without too much effort or exhaustion, or if you just like the satisfaction that comes with shattering monsters with freezing arrow, then a cold bowazon build with ice may be the build for you. So there we have it, guys. Thanks for watching all the way this far. I've tried to pack a lot of information into this video, so I hope you got something out of it one way or another. If you did, then do hit that like button and share this video. If you have any questions at all, or have any bowazon related video ideas that you want me to cover, sound off in the comments below. And as always, to see more bowazon related content, please do subscribe and hit that notification bell. Until then, please stay safe and I will see you in the next one.